Oh, let me look at myself.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Gcobani, and I'm going to be moderating the session, which just simply means taking care of the tech side. So it's really good. We're very happy today to host Kagiso Nko, who will be presenting on his important work on mental health. I don't know how many people have read, but there have been so many articles I've read in the past few months, actually in the past year, that have been talking about how mental health is actually going to be the next pandemic. And this really links to the ways in which not only COVID, but even the conditions that we existed under even before have all stretched our mental fitness. So it's really fitting to have KG here, especially to think about mental health in higher education settings. As we've seen in the past few weeks in South Africa, the various ways in which young people are terrorized in the academy. So I really think this work is important. And KG sent me a comment by someone who was asking, why is it important that we think about mental health in anthropology? And I think, I think when people think about mental health, of course, anthropology would not be the subject that comes, the discipline that comes to mind, but actually anthropologists have contributed so much to our understanding of health, particularly through medical anthropology, because we are concerned with not only what influences, we're concerned with what influences our health and our well-being, and certainly mental fitness or mental health is an important part of well-being. And we've certainly seen in the past decade, medical anthropologists, the way in which medical anthropologists have made us understand or helped us to understand health not just as a physiological issue, but that it's actually social. And that so we understand health not just in biological terms, but we also understand the role of the social, how racism, how inequality, how class stratification, and so many other factors influence our well-being. So without wasting any more time, it's not my day today. I will hand over to you, Chris, and hopefully we'll have a really productive discussion after. So over to you, KG.
Yeah, thank you so much, Qcobani. So I did this work back in 2018 and had left it for quite a bit. And Qcobani had suggested to me that, I can present it, given, the time we sort of like exist in now. And I took it as an opportunity to one, to go back to this work, and secondly, because I know how these spaces can be generative and productive in sort of like, pushing forward, ideas, that we sort of like come up with in academia and all those things in the public sphere. So thank you so much. So I titled this presentation Mental Health Discourse as a transformational claim, tentatively, because I do not necessarily wanna go back to how I looked at the work in 2018, 2019, but I wanted to look, at it from a different lens, right? Hence, transformation. And but before I get into that, I just wanna sort of like give you a background to the study, so that when I come to this question, you have an idea of what the study entailed and stuff. So the rationale for this for this research that I'm sort of like leaning into and trying to think about, focus on the post peace must fall moment. And I know a colleague of mine, you know, mm, newly Dr. Ndlovu would say it's not a post peace must fall moment, but a suspended moment because, given the protests that have been happening, about the same issues, after the 2015, 2016, protests. So I looked at this moment, we saw an increase in sort of like the articulation of mental health, discourse among Black students, So I feel like it gave sort of like heated debates, and discussions about racial inequality, about lack of transformation, about economic inequality, social inequality, and such. So this moment, the post-fees must fall moment, or this suspended moment, created a space for a whole range of issues to be brought up to the fore, one of those being mental health, and because of the physical and mental violence towards students during the time, they experienced a lot of trauma, me included. I was part of both the 2015 and 2016, protests. Students would then use the language of trauma to express the violence they face, and we saw this in the rise, in the use of the language of mental health in the everyday, where such as triggered, which is part of PTS discourse, started being used everywhere. So the post-Fismas 4 moment is used here to interrogate and explore links between events such as that of Fismas 4, the proliferation of mental health discourse, community building, and unity and exploration of Blackness as something which is not immune to mental health. So I looked at how people use this discourse, as a way to define mental health, and related suffering as a problem of Blackness, and not something that's necessarily relegated to whiteness or the middle class. I also look at mental discourse, as something that was used as a mode of talking about a crisis or simply pressure, and yeah, basically that was the rationale for the project. So the framework I appropriated, Adriana Petrina, who's I think UPenn based anthropologist, concept of biological citizenship. So I use the concept of mental health citizenship in relation to a small community of students and not necessarily a population like Petrina's work. I appropriate this, through discourse analysis to locate and map communities, organized around mental health discourse and to understand the lived and contested experiences of the students through interviews and observation. Method. So I use the bread and butter of anthropologists, which is participant observation and interview. So a lot of, ironically, not ironically, but a lot of my research, I think, data came from participant observation. I'll say almost 80%, and the interviews were more clarification interviews more than anything. So engaging conversations with like students who get mental health in communal spaces at Wits, where I was doing my research, and I went there as a postgrad student, so a lot of my immediate participants, were my fellow colleagues, and postgraduate students. So I spent a lot of time with them, and I also really, spend a lot of time just, paying attention to what was going on campus in terms of, how mental health was being operationalized or used by students, and I, basic thing about rapport, and it was so easy because of, so my research was done later on in the year. So I had formed a lot of close relationships with a lot of people who would now inform sort of like my research. So it was not necessarily difficult for me to form rapport, when I started doing the research. And then, yeah, and big part of it also was that I spent a lot of time on campus as a postgrad student. As many of you might know, you see, we have a privilege of being given spaces on campus to work and all those things. So, those spaces also made it easy for me to access, you know, people who could really sort of like help me with my research. And like I said, I did in-depth interviews, more clarification, sort of like to collect stories and reflections, with regards to how participants experience Christmas 4 and how it's sort of like informing how they view one, and which is sort of like the subject of my research, that mental health now. Uh, Method. So in thinking about this particular question, I'm reading a ethnography by Nancy Shepherd Hughes, who I adore, especially in terms of her writing, but in terms of even placing, sort of like the humanity in the middle of anthropology. So she talks about the field, and I talk about my research in this case. You know, this presentation one, comes months after I guess years, of not only engaging mental discourse but also being diagnosed, with mental illnesses, and a big part of why I appreciate anthropology is the ability to sort of like zero in on an individual in relation to the society and vice versa and stuff. So I like this sort of like thinking by Nancy Shepherd Hughes in terms of what it means for us to think of the field or the research. And she says that, the field is a place both proximate and intimate to us, which was very true, in my case. And what emerges usually is highly subjective. And I like this highly subjective, partial, fragmentary, but also deeply felt personal record of human lives, based on eyewitness and testimony, and which sort of like gives us sort of like, um, I don't want to say the validity, but which give validity to a study, that's usually someone has their mic on, and I think they can just mute it because it's quite distractive. So apologies, can you just mute if there's anyone not muted? Thank you. Yeah, so I like this. So I'm thinking about this particular question in relation to sort of like Nancy Shepherd Hugh, and she says that of witnessing is what lends our work its moral and sometimes its theological character. And obviously, I understand, there are fundamental differences between Shepherd Hughes, who's a very traditional anthropologist, and I, in that I was doing anthropology at home one, and unlike a lot of research I was doing, mm, mm, my research, also like on a horizontal plane. So usually with a lot of studies, there's always a top-down approach where people, up there, researchers, people with some sort of hegemonic power and all those things, study people down here with margins. And my research was very fundamentally different in the sense that I was doing research on a subject which impacted my peers, and and to a certain extent, the question that I'm addressing is also autoethnographic in terms of thinking. So the literature, briefly, so with reference to existing scholarly work, so I draw here from Adriana Petrina's Biological Citizenship, which was a major organizing, tool in my understanding. So the title of my research, and I should have mentioned this in the beginning, was titled Creating a Mental Health Citizen. So the concept of biological citizen was really major in terms of how I organize sort of like my thinking towards this. You know. So I drew from her in order to form my own concerns with parallel development of what I call mental health citizenship. So how people organize around suffering, as with her Ukraine Chernobyl nuclear victims who became biological citizenship because they felt entitled to state remit. So they in a research she sort of like traces how people sort of like access state help because of how they were exposed to the nuclear, when Chernobyl, the nuclear bombing and stuff, and how they can now access sort of like state help. So I also was looking at the sense at how students sort of like at look at themselves as people who are under this concern of framework of mental health citizenship, and how they use that to navigate their everyday lives and also um, access certain things and entitlements. So I also looked at organizing around suffering as created around emerging communities by Anderson, organized around suffering and adjacent concepts such as caregiving, healing, as nothing new, so I referred to Facine, Didier Facine, I referred to Turner and Janssen, who wrote, a long time ago on sort of like suffering. The second thing I looked at was exploring blackness as a theme. So blackness is, and I see it, and it's something I'm really interested even in my PhD study. It's it's an issue which is constantly being reconfigured and embodied through different media and in different modes, and rooted in complex histories and genealogies. So, in framing blackness for sort of like my research, then I looked at claims by weight. I leaned into bell hooks a lot. I looked at Transformational, and I looked at Sexton, about how they think about the mutability and immutability of racial identification, especially in the context of South African sort of social political landscape and history. And then I looked at a bit of Fees Must Fall, and I looked at the history of protests in South Africa, and then finally I looked at anthropology and other perspectives on the question of mental health. And as Qcobani said in the beginning, anthropologists have been doing a lot of work on health, through medical anthropology and mental health. So they look at the social life of mental health, and it's something that's being studied extensively, and no longer just the purview of the biological sciences or psychiatry. So I looked at the work of Kleinman. I looked at João Bill. I leaned into his ethnography about social abandonment in Brazil a lot. I looked at Karen Nakamura's ethnography on in Japan. So it's like to get different perspectives on how mental health is viewed, especially outside the West or the global North. Yeah. And then findings. So a little bit about my findings for context sake. So I looked at, so my findings were sort of like a auto-ethnography reflection, as well as an archival chapter on the mass form movements. I looked at the discourse of mental health at an institutional level, and then I looked at like discrete practices by students of mental health in their everyday lives. The Fees Must Fall chapter, looked at, post Fees Must Fall as a suspended moment. As I said, Dr. Ndo would rather have it referred to that. So I wrote a whole substantive chapter actually, on Fees Must Fall, trying to create a thread between a discourse now and how the trauma of Fees Must Fall could have been responsible for the discourse of mental health later on. And this chapter was sort of like a preamble to the ethnography that will follow later, and a lot of issues, not a lot of issues, but I reflected on the decolonial turn. So transformation as it lacks and how it's needed. So at Wits, we saw a lot of buildings being renamed, especially after Fees Must Fall, Solomon Mahlangu building, the Sobukwe block and stuff. I look at Rhodes Must Fall as identitarian politics, which was something very funny. Sorry for digressing, but when former VC of Wits said that we concentrate on identitarian politics instead of the real issues, I found it quite a bit funny, because I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. And for me, identitarian politics, such as identifying as black, politically and all those things, it's a category of parties that I feel like it's needed for us to really just fight a lot of structural inequalities black people face. So I looked at this chapter. I looked at Fees Must Fall as fighting precarity and other issues, and reflected on trauma through state-mandated violence. And I did a bit of a self-reflection on the Fees Must Fall protests myself, and the subsequent PTSD, anxiety, diagnosis, and the many students, still suffer from the trauma, anxiety, depression, and mental illness because of those protests. So this chapter was a bit of that. And the next chapter was the discourse at institutional level. Let me just do this. So during Fees Must Fall, mental health emerged as an issue that was really, a big, now becoming part of sort of like the social and self-imagination of Black students. So the consequence increase in the awareness of mental health created new relations to an environment where various universities, institutions offered help and care with regards to their mental health, which I don't think was not there before. But I think for me, a big argument of mine was that Black students are now more and more, not that there were not any, more and more really just seeing themselves as part of this discourse. So I sort of like looked at that in this chapter, at how university offices, including those of student governance, navigated issues of mental health at an institutional level. And on this chapter, uh, I looked at discrete practices of sort of like, students in everyday. So a big part of it was I never wanted to go to students or be like, yeah, do you think, your life or the way you do things is about either your mental health and whatever person? So I had to really just be patient in just mm, and being sure that whatever they do, and also reflecting a lot of my subjective experiences, that this are really something that really contributes to the mental health of students. So I reflected on this on the chapter, where many students at the university or doing research on express that the space they find themselves, which is a university, they just need to survive, get things done, and come out the other side in one piece. And then this didn't necessarily mean they could avoid the pressures of university life. So I tried to locate, and highlight ways in which students, and mostly Black students, deal with issues of everyday precarity such as homelessness and hunger, and how that fits into discussions of mental health. You know, and how sometimes these issues are instrumentalized by students to survive institutional exclusion. So I explore such linkages in this chapter, and yeah. So the question of my presentation, the title of my presentation. So the question I'm grappling with now, and this is something that's ongoing. So like I said, initially in the beginning, I really started thinking about this now, but I really just wanna think about it a lot more because I think it's important and generative to think about. So I'm grappling with this one, and I do believe that students are using whatever it is at their disposal to transform themselves or the environments they find themselves in. And one of those things is, through mental health discourse. So for this, I lean into Bell Hooks' quote to start thinking about this. So Bell Hooks says, right, for those of us who dare to desire differently, who seek to look away from the conventional ways of seeing blackness in ourselves, the issue of race and representation is not just a question of critiquing the status quo. It is also about transforming the image, creating alternatives, asking ourselves questions about what types of image subvert post-critical alternatives, and transform our worldviews and move us away from dualistic thinking about the good and bad. Obviously, here the Hooks was reflecting a lot on sort of like media representation of blackness and stuff. But I also find it very pregnant to sort of like lean into, especially in terms of how students start seeing themselves within a particular discourse, and how sort of like that discourse, sort of forces them to, not forces them, but allows them to have this transformational and transformative claims, you know, for their own sort of like sense of self and identities, and you know, and for very sort of like practical things such as accessing material resources, that they might need and all that. So, and also with this, I reflect on it with what Ike Anya says. So Ike Anya is a Nigerian doctor who wrote a piece for Granta, and on it, the piece of the name of the title of the piece is, Black people can suffer from mental health. I'm paraphrasing here. I don't think I remember it in all those things. So this is part of that. It's part of saying that actually Black people can. We exist in the discourse, and at this moment in our life, at this point in time, we also really sort of like see ourselves and imagine ourselves as people, one, who can have mental health problems, and secondly, people can exist within this discourse. So how am I thinking about this? So the process of transformation is almost as if it's militant in its militant and radical, where people sort of like start to think of themselves, outside how they've been socialized to see themselves. So they tweet here, really below the sentiment of trying to imagine ourselves differently, even in the system that is inherently white. Mm, Twitter user Candice Benbow tweets that younger millennials and Gen Z aren't holding on to trauma and keeping secrets the way many of us were taught to. It makes many of us uncomfortable, and they're navigating the newfound implications of this truth in real time. But they're trying to be free. That matters. And then Twitter user Ubia then replies and says, everyone talks about breaking generational patterns in theory, but bugs at the reality of it. This is exactly it, shining light on the hidden places can be ugly and painful but freeing. So part of it is recognizing the works, what works for us as Black people, as Black students, and what doesn't. The transformation may be transient, or modes used for said transformation may be of transient use, but does not mean take away the fact that it is through, in a small way, mental health discourse, on campuses. This doesn't indicate an incisive win in fighting, whatever mental problems because of structural inequality we might face as Black people, but rather that Black students are more and more starting to connect dots between their own well-being, structural inequality, precarity, and academic performance through mental health discourse. So I'm struggling with sort of like how to think about this. So tentatively, I just said through these 3 points. So how am I thinking about this? So I am thinking about it using sort of like an autoethnographic lens, and it's sort of like a form of qualitative research where I use a lot of self-reflection and writing to explore personal experiences, and connect them to wider cultural, political, and social meanings and understandings. So at this point, this is not the obviously final, but at this point, I'm thinking about this question of mental health discourse as a transformational claim through these 3 points, through my own experience as a student, reflect on my time as a tutor and a lecturer, and reflect on the bits of my MA research, which I gave you a rough overview, a high level overview of in the beginning. Yeah. So, thinking about the discourse of mental health through my time as a student, so I'm gonna tell you a bit of a story here. Don't know. I think I have time. Do I have time? So it's only been half an hour.
You have more than enough time.
Yes, yes. I just see. Thank you so much. So when I started school in Joburg at the Orange University, I stayed in a township just outside Krugersdorp, where I am now actually. And then we were so many in the house. I remember we were about like 4 cousins, and like we were like about 8 or 9, in my where I was staying. And this was okay. I'm not gonna even try and play this politics of, oh my God, it was such a struggle. But the struggle was I had to travel to Joburg every day. So I have to wake up at around like 4 a.m. and leave at around 5 and walk 5Ks to catch a train, so that I can be at the university at 7 a.m. when the library opened. I did this for about 6 months or so, and food was a huge thing. So I was sort of like operating on empty. So I never even thought, because I don't necessarily have food to eat during the day, I'm not gonna go. So I was just like, let me just go all that. So I would be there at the library at 7 because it was, I think, one place for me to be able, one, to have a working space, secondly, peace and quiet, and thirdly, like resources. So I would go there and I would leave the campus at around 5 p.m., doing the whole process in reverse, and then get home at around 8 or 9 in the evening. depending on whether the train got stuck or not. So if any one of you has taken metro rail trains, they're notorious, especially in the evenings. In the mornings, they really got stuck, but they were notorious for getting stuck in the middle of nowhere for about 30 minutes. So I get home, do my chores, sit down the dining room table and complete my work, and then go to bed by sort of like midnight. Got used to the routine, internalized it. I was like, this is it, you know, and stuff. And I did well the first semester. I was like, okay, cool. Second semester started off a bit shaky because of family politics. I had to move a bit further away from Joburg. So I was in Krugersdorp, which was easier, one, because of the train, and two, because of the taxi. But I had to move even further away. And then that means incurring more costs. I had to ask my mother, unemployed mother, for taxi money and subsistence, when she could. So by the end of term three, I had enough. So I started knocking on doors. I went to the acting dean at the time. I was like, hey man, help me out. So I used my resilience narrative, so that she could see a reason and help me out to at least move closer to school. She told me she could not give me money, but she would refer me to people. I got this being of fourth term, I got a job as a student assistant, moved into very cheap flat in the suburb of Westdean, about 15, 20 minutes walk from school. And then this, you think, oh, finally, some kind of, reprieve from this punishment. But this was not, the last of it. So for the next couple of months, I would face financial insecurity. So I remember when I got there, they told me, we're giving you 75% off your tuition. And I was like, yo, I'm going to take it. They didn't say anything about anything else, but this is more than enough. It wasn't. So every end of each year, I would not see my results because I owed fees, which is one of the most ironic thing I think us as students had, experience in a university where universities will tell you need to pay off your fees, but you can't see your results. If you can't see your results, you can't go ask for help. You can't go ask for sponsorship because you don't have your results. So this was very stressful. It was very stressful, but somehow because of the people who were my biggest supporters and all those things, they always got covered beginning of the following year. You know, but I was always hot with anxiety of asking for help. Of not seeing my results, of whether I failed. It came with a lot of indignity and shame. And I think a lot of students, not that I think, a lot of students actually experience this because every year without fail, there will be protests in front of the university main building, about financial institution and stuff. I also experienced a lot of physical and mental insecurity. Because of where I live, I got marked more than two times. So I had a lot of PTSD, and I used PTSD in the most general of sense, after all the incidents. So I had no options but to go anyway. So I had to continue staying where I was, despite the fact access was a huge issue. and I know it's a bit ambiguous here, but access to a lot of things. So but the biggest one was access to a working space, internet, which was basically needed to do a lot of things, right? Access to course materials was also huge, like textbooks are pricey, they're expensive, So I had to spend many nights at the university so I can access the computers, internet, books, and you also sort of like, had the suspended safety of being home and away from prying eyes, right? So sleeping, I know it was not allowed, when I was doing my undergrad. So you'd have to just like pack up when you're extremely tired at 2 a.m. and just, make your way home, in the early hours of the morning to sometimes very unsafe neighborhoods around the university. So before I move on and reflecting on this with sort of like COVID, how it was so wild that online learning had to be a thing now, considering issues of access for a lot of students. But anyway, I digress. Going back, I looked also at hunger, which was an issue for me, I remember. So I find out that there are feeding schemes on campus, but feeding schemes had time and whatever and all those things. So I remember most of my time when the food was given out or whatever and all those things, I would be in class. So I miss out. So I had to really just, you know, depend on my friends a lot, for food and such. So I was deeply anxious and needed to do, you know, well all the time in order to ask for the right help. So I never once connected my very precarious existence to my mental health until one day in my second year undergrad, I had an overwhelming feeling of any at all. I know this is quite a long story, but I think it's very important for us to reflect on these things. I was like, nah, man, something is not right. I was proactive enough to go to the university counseling unit, and then when I when I got there, I was advised that maybe I should drop out, go work, then come back and self fund. And I remember thinking how unfair that is actually, because one, always look at your academic performance as placing you as more deserving of things. So I was like, how could they say that when I'm doing so well and all those things? Right? Because my job, I remember it wasn't pay me enough to really just get through the month. So I remember another big part of my anxiety being about how much I've become a burden on my mother because I wanted to go to university. And this is after a failed attempt at another degree at a different university. And later that year, I would experience more traumatic events, one of them being Christmas 4, in which I'd be officially diagnosed with anxiety the following year. So I'm trying to think about, how sort of like me encountering sort of like mental health through all this precarious thing really, you know, one I think made me have had a transformative effect in a sense that now I think the biggest thing when we think university is that, you know, we think just studying and passing it's all that's needed. But because of me encountering mental health, it had this transformative effect in a sense that I started to think about how that's not necessarily only it and how it took this sort of like, structural issues for me to start thinking about that and to start thinking about my mental health. Was a process because I think more times than most, this is not something that we are necessarily taught to think about ourselves. That hey, I'm having mm, mental health issues. I'm having issues of concentration. I'm stressed. I don't have food. I'm anxious. I can't study, and all those things. So you end up relegating a lot of the I'm stressed, I'm under pressure, I'm anxious, and whatever to the side. So I started to think about this a lot more. Retrospectively also because I can say that it took me a while to really just claim that mental health is something that's part of my daily experience, and then you know therefore I'm entitled to some sort of, I think, help. I don't know, but yeah, the next one I started to think about was as a tutor. So I was on the other side, and this didn't necessarily mean I was not free of precarity. Tutor lectureship, yeah, it was a whole other ball game because you need to hold space for both you and your students. And I think it's easier when you find yourself in a less precarious space or in a rather healthy space, a positive space to do that. But I had to do this with my already existing sort of like precarity. So the last 2 years I taught in South African University, both as tutor. I've seen Black students confront the issue of their mental health and claiming the right to do so. It was painful to witness. As I could see, this was at that breaking point, but I think one thing I was that they were doing it. You eventually sort of like get all the necessary allowances, And I know as a lecturer, I did this because I understood, one, because of COVID, two, because of going home, and also having the resources and all these things, and now having to deal with issues of, family. Not that family is a bad thing, but being allowed to just be a student were really coming to the fore. you know. So on this, I reflect on like a couple of experiences. So my time as a tutor in a lecture, which was 2.5 years, I had at least 8 students come to me and complain, not complain, because, but really tell me that they are facing a lot of pressure and stress due to the very precarious and structural, inequalities they're facing. One, it was my first year at the university down the road from the Orange universities. I don't know why I can't mention them, but I think maybe the comfort levels are not there. But I, the student would email me and tell me that they are they don't have a place to stay, one, and then they are really struggling with their mental health to be to even come to class to concentrate and do the work well. And it's because she's facing all these issues, off campus. The department, which is a very caring department, I'll admit, would try to help her as much as they could, but she couldn't make it and she had to come back the following year. And then one other instance was when I was in a class and I could see that one of my students was not present, and I would ask him to come outside and speak to me. And immediately when he got outside, I remember the student bursting into tears and telling me that, they've been kicked out, of where they stay, all those things, and could the student be excused and, try go home, call family, and sort it out and all those things. And then when I was a lecturer, a couple of students, especially after after they were sent home because of COVID, a lot of them, one, were actually struggling with their mental health, where they couldn't access, the services they used to on campus, and therefore they were struggling to really do their work, which was a lot in theory, heavy, and all those things. And I had to exercise some sort of like, I don't know, the English word is not coming to me, but I had to allow allowances and be like, you know what, it's okay. Mm, you can submit whenever you feel like, and they were very. But and then they also did this where they would say, I'm not lying, you know, look, there's a letter from my psychologist saying that I suffer from this and that. And then some of them be like, we have low shading and all those things. So the students were really sort of like um, leaning into the fact that they're not doing well in terms of their mental health, and because of the very, very serious and immediate material concerns they were having. So the big idea around this is that students are beginning to think about their own mental health as something which is intrinsically linked to their material conditions, and not something that's separate. Students are also thinking about their mental health not as a resilience exercise, but as an issue of structural inequalities that they face due to systemic and structural issues. So there is a transformation there. Through them interacting with their own mental health and the discourse around that begs them to see the abnormality and absurdity of the system which is violent towards them, yet they're expected to thrive and succeed. So mental health discourse is but many ways students are reckoning with their transformation. They transform the space, they transform the students in contrast to the space that is intrinsically exclusionary and violent. And they are therefore embracing the vulnerability, of their own lives and realities. There's a rejection of this resilience narrative, which means rejection of structural and symbolic violence meted against students on the daily. And lastly, I think of this through my research, you know. So through like discrete practices, of students and institutional practices, Black students were finding ways to cope and navigate and thrive in an environment which is very difficult for them through this discourse on campus. Part of it, part of it is how it transformed Black students to now see themselves as part of the discourse. Also, mental health as an issue which is important to them, inundated by issues of precarity, structural issues such as homelessness, hunger, access to spaces of refuge and healing, etc. So what are those? What are those sort of like practices? A big one. So I did my research at the later part of 2018, and then through my interviews, I found out that it's usually referred to as the Jacaranda season. So Jacaranda season, it's about the advent of exams, for students, but it's also how sort of like mental health discourse manifests during this period. And in this particular period, it was so painful to see because there were a couple of suicide attempts by students, and then obviously the university will send out emails, and then we'll see a think piece by the dean of students in Daily Maverick about how you know students are struggling, and the email from the VC will say they know this is a time of stress and all those things. And a big critique that came through there was that students were critiquing this model of institutional and psychological time by the university, in a sense that they know, it's easy. I think for me, it's easy if students had, institutional, support and, and social support and all those things. And the stress was only passing, and all those things. But students were sort of like critiquing that in a sense that it's reactionary in in a sense that the processes in which the suffering has come upon people, as does would claim, is not taken into consideration. So besides us, I was a tutor there supporting the students and all those things. What we sometimes don't know is what students are going through their daily lives, and in terms of financial exclusion, in terms of hunger, in terms of which were issues which were known. So I think a big part of it was there's a whole critique against that. The universities, this, but yet you wait till the end and then you talk about this as if it's an issue of only exam stress, but it's a lot of things that have been compounded, that come to this. Jesus. So there's a huge critique against sort of like this reactionary, um, to the model of this particular time, the Jacaranda season. And one of the students would say to me that the university could do more to make sure that this happens from the departments upwards. So, it's like students, lecturers, academic staff are making life difficult for students. They lack empathy, and they understand that students do not do well because of a whole host of problems, including personal problems. What is painful is seeing the disparity between the different students in terms of being given leeway based on whether students fulfill the university's prerequisites of having things such as sick letters from doctors. For most students, especially Black students, access to doctors or therapists is not something that's readily available. So, and then Climate sort of like speaks to this issue of how mental health discourse could be seen as something that's a political issue because it takes into consideration the socio-economic realities, of people which the universities was not necessarily thinking about. And then students were also instrumentalizing mental health to fight just something I found on my interview. So one of my students are academically.
I can see Cage's connection is quite low. Can we just give him a minute to come?
Okay. Oof.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Oh, you can hear me, yes. Oh,
Yes,
I
you are
didn't
back.
see that on my side. Can you
Sure.
hear me? Oh, I'm back.
Yeah.
Cool.
Perfectly.
So
Sure.
students will instrumentalize, sort of like the discourse around mental health to fight academic exclusion. So this was a sort of like an open public secret of some sort. So students would need to post. So what students also would do would go to the counseling unit at the universities every time they face some sort of personal problem or material problem, whether it's food, it's hunger, it's food insecurity, whether it's homelessness or lack of accommodation, or whether it's their own mental health. And at the end, they would need to show sort of like that they've been, so they would need to show some sort of documentation, in terms of how they've been trying to really deal with this problem. And then lastly, politically organizing around the discourse of mental health. So at that time, I think there were elections near 2018, and a lot of political parties on campus were really campaigning again with mental health, as something that's a big issue in the university and that needs to be addressed. Although limited, as he did not take the social implications of mental health. So big part of it was like we need more counseling 24-hour and all those things. But I'm like, in terms of the material realities of students, it doesn't say much. So I'm trying to think about that through these three things, my life as a teacher, as someone who needs whole space, and my life and my research. Oh, conclusion, hectic. So, in conclusion, while mental health in higher education has always looked at mental health problems, you know, as both common and severe, looking at mental health problems as only associated with academic underperformance, the lack of soft skills, such as self-management and stress and emotion regulation skills, ignores the material realities most students face, which greatly impacts their mental health. Transformation for Black students is beyond the name of buildings, changing of curriculum, but it's also about, validating institutions to fundamentally understand that where they exist also exist issues of structural inequality, poverty, access, safety, and security, and thus have to account for individuals who find themselves on the margin, which greatly contributes to their mental health issues. Mental health discourse continues to be a catalyst, among and for Black students in that sense. Yeah, I'm done. Any questions, comments, or feedback? I really appreciate feedback.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think you've given us so much to think through in that presentation, and I've been reading quite a lot on this area of sort of trauma-informed care in education. And it's really around how do we become more compassionate educators or practitioners, understanding, of course, the prevalence of trauma in students. And it's also been something very similar to me. There's almost no student I've spoken to who doesn't, in one form or another, to get to know them, carry forms of trauma. So, and what's always surprising to me, and I think you've raised it so well in the presentation, is really this idea that, not really idea, sorry, it's the ways in which universities often ask the wrong questions, right? And what trauma-informed care asks us to do is to move away from this sort of, what's wrong with you, that's so prevalent in higher education, and to move to questions of what happened to you. And I think the tweet by the Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg this week is so symptomatic of the ways in which I think institutions don't really understand the material realities of students, so it's assumed just you failed. And I think, as you said in the conclusion, that they're all around performance, right? And they this kind of consideration of all these material realities that could affect someone not finishing their degree on time. So I thought the presentation was really so layered, and I know that it's a focus for you. So I'm going to open up now to questions, comments, and whilst feel free to just raise your hand or to type your comment if you can speak. And then so far, I'll just read Horata's comment, which was that she was really excited for this presentation. The topic is so important because mental health, guys, and she's so grateful to you for taking it up. So
thank you, Horata.
Feel free. So if you want to raise your hand and you're not familiar with the platform, there's a little icon at the bottom, like someone raising their hand. Okay, Tabang, I see you. Is there anyone else? Esihle has a question. We'll take three. One more. Going. Come on, people. One more. Okay. Let's go to Tabang so long. Tabang, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Good day, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
A bit louder, Tabang.
A bit faint.
I'm sorry, I still had my mask on in the office. Lovely hearing, lovely topic today, and as always, KG, I think you were very articulate. You're very articulate in your points, and listening to your story, although I've heard it many times before, is always so interesting, always so inspiring to me. I just wanted you to know, you've known me for a long time. How do you think that your challenges and challenges of students in general translate the PTSD from the whole being in varsity can translate to beyond that when you enter the professional space, especially in terms of how you relate to newfound better income, more wealth, more access? Do you think that the PTSD from that affects how we live the lavish lifestyles we try to project? Does it also affect, I think you are getting my point from your smile. I love your smile. Okay, I hope you understand what I'm trying to get at, and I really get you. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tabang. Okay, I think Esihle was next, and then Grazia. We'll take three at a time. There's also a few in the comment section, but let's take three first. So, Esihle and then Grazia.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you, Kagiso. I have a page full of notes, and I've got a few questions, so I'll wait for like a few rounds. But my first question is going to go to the bell hook sort of quote that you shared. And my relationship with bell hooks is a scholar that writes a lot about love, right? So I wonder what the place of love is when we're thinking about mental health as a transformational discourse, and in what ways is that alienating, if there are any of those ways?
Yeah, cool.
Okay, and then Grazia.
Thanks, Qobani. Kagiso, thank you for your presentation on your engagement. I first wanted to also just acknowledge and thank you for sharing a lot of your life experiences and offering them up as research. I enjoy autoethnography as a method. I think it's a very critical method for Black folks to use, particularly in the academy. But with that being said, I think there's also something important in recognizing the kind of split that always happens when we even take and contribute our own experiences as forms of research, and the disconnect and dissonances that are exposed just in that movement. So with that being said, just thanks for sharing a lot of your experiences. I was quite intrigued by this notion of
I can't hear Katya.
I think she, let me just see. She might, she's still unmuted. Grazia, you got cut off.
Okay, let me just move around. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, we can. We can now.
Okay.
Okay. So did you miss the first part, Kagiso?
I got the first part about ethnography and how.
Okay. So I was saying I've been intrigued by this notion of the mental health citizen that you're questioning and you're working around with. And I suppose perhaps maybe towards the end of the research, it would be like, is that a form of citizenry that you feel is achievable, considering the mental health challenges that you have cited and are reflecting on? And then I think tied quite closely to that, what also intrigued me in the same conversation around the autoethnographic was this idea of a self-diagnosis. So coming to terms with and identifying yourself as somebody who is experiencing PTSD and other mental health challenges, but perhaps even outside of a professional diagnosis. So it's not a therapist or maybe a mental health practitioner who is
Okay, Grazia, we've lost you again. I think KG, in the interest of time, I think she had captured much of what she wanted to say.
I got the first part of the question, yeah.
Sure, I think, can you take the first three?
Yeah, PTSD and workspace. Very interesting question, Tama. I don't know. I honestly don't know how it sort of like manifests when you go up. And I think a big part of, I'll just say generally and sort of like speculate a lot on their side, is that a big part of why we go to university, especially as Black people, is sort of like to make sure that we attain some sort of dignified life, later on and stuff. And it doesn't stop after university. And there might be a lot of pressure to still perform at work, and there might be a lot of fear of failure because the university has showed us that really it doesn't necessarily care for students. So how would sort of like a workspace, and I like to say capitalism, do this? So I think you sit with a lot of the trauma, and then part of it is like this thing of where you fail, you fear to fail because you want to live a dignified life, and that's a big part of why we end up internalizing a lot of things, and they become very symbolically violent in our lives. It's because we are chasing some sort of like a dignified life. So we sit with it, and I'm speculating it because I'm not there yet, and I can't really comment much further than that. And thank you for coming, Taba. I know you're at work now. Esihle, I thought I captured your question well, but I'll just sort of like try to make sense of it. But what about love, right? In terms of the discourse of students, especially looking at that quote by Bell Hooks, right? So, and when I was thinking through this, I was thinking about how students, and I think it's, oh no, that's another question. So I think what I didn't necessarily try to highlight, and I think it's a big part of the discourse, the mental health discourse, that it's somehow has to do with sort of like negativity, but mental health is about, sort of like taking care of yourself mentally, I imagine. So I think thinking through this code is that, students, especially young students, as with those tweets, are practicing this thing where, them sort of like claiming sort of like this discourse. It's not necessarily only a reaction of, the system, but it's also about them taking care of themselves and sort of like practicing self-care, for lack of a better word, right? So yeah, I don't have much to say on that, but other that Bell Hooks offers a claim where now blackness or black students can really think of themselves differently, from how they've been sort of like socialized. And part of it, it's loving themselves, and fighting, radically fighting to love themselves and take care of themselves. Yeah. And then Grazio's question about mental health citizenship as something that's achievable. I think slowly but surely, and a big part of mental health citizenship is not about the recognition of the structures, of like you said, university side, but it's about students now realizing that they are people who can sort of like contend with their own mental health and can be part of the discourse and can have mental health problems, can be mentally healthy. So I think it is something that's achievable, although I don't think anytime soon, because we're fighting against a huge current of being raised to think that, mental health is not necessarily something that's an issue of blackness. Yeah, I didn't get the other question, but this is my thoughts on these questions. Thank you for the questions. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, if you wanna ask some questions
yeah.
I'm gonna read it to you, KG. So if you wanna,
Yes.
I already see one hand. There's someone speaking.
Mr. Brown.
No, I see his hand, but there's quite a few comments, so we'll come back to him. I just want to get through the comments. So if you have, okay, I see a couple of hands, but let's first get through the comments, because those people also deserve to be heard. So Hemali said, thank you, KG, for a thought-provoking presentation and for sharing your story. Horata said, thank you so much for sharing, and so this will be question one, and she asked, do you have any thoughts from your research or thinking since you completed the research about the possible connections between mental health and spirituality? So that's Horata's question.
Okay.
Tandega Kati wrote, thank you, Kagiso, for eloquently verbalizing a trauma that most Black students face. My heart is heavy because this is a trauma that has stayed with me beyond my university days. Dr. Marian Brooks wrote, I'll just add before I have to run that there's a lot in the global mental health discourse in health, talking about social, political, economic factors being so tired, too much of mental illness in many parts of the world. Okay, I didn't read that very well. This is sort of its own category compared to other mental illness descriptions, often seen in high-income people without the same barriers. Diana wrote, I think you could do a better job at introducing the mental health services to students. Outside of them questioning it in the given course pack, there needs to be an integrated module or course, especially if you think about how students have to prove their struggle, quote unquote, prove their struggle. And then Dr. Marian Brooks continued, it makes me wonder, this is a continuation from the first comment, it makes me wonder if we should speak about it distinctly, of if it can be cured by, say, cash transfers or more time to do assignments or etc., what we're talking about. And if you go for therapy, will it then fixing the material issues would boost? But she said she has to run, but great talk. Then, so that's question number two. Question number three is from Sipokuhle, who asks, can someone summarize for me the idea of mental health citizen? I am terribly late. So that's question three. Okay, let me give you a fourth one because it's here. It's welcome. It's not a question. It's just welcome. Lishiba says, I missed it. I'll have to catch the record great job on such an important topic. And then Esihle's second question, this will be question 4. I'm going to give you 5 questions now. And he's asking, looking at the various roles that Kagiso has been in the academy, what are some of the visible similarities and differences between students who were in university during Fees Must Fall and those who entered post Fees Must Fall? And then please take the 5th one, and then I'll stop here, which is Gracia just clarifying her question, which was, the question was around how ethnography can be a useful way of self-experiential diagnosis for mental health when access to professional services is not always accessible. So that's a question she's asking, for example, if you are coming to terms with your own experience of post-traumatic stress disorder, so can you use autoethnography as a form of self-diagnosis of self? There's quite a lot more, but let's stop at this one, and then I'm going to take the sort of hands that I saw. I saw Tabang, and then I think it was Maseko. But yeah,
Yes.
a lot.
So Horata, I haven't thought about sort of like the connections between mental health and spirituality, which there's a lot of sort of like literature on, but I haven't. It's not something that I'm looking at, but I can speculate and say that, spirituality and especially church for Black people has been sort of like a source of comfort, for a lot of for Black people. I'm not gonna say a lot or less Black people, but it has also been a source of trauma for some Black people. But I haven't explored that. And then the other question was, oof, Diana, yes, will going to therapy help, but then fixing the material issues would boost. I don't think I'm getting this question, but I can say, categorically that going to therapy helps you in the most basic sense of what psychology or therapy helps you with, which is about dealing with your own sort of like issues that you're facing and that are affecting your mental health, how to navigate those. But it doesn't necessarily solve fixed material issues, and that's why I contended with how when the when political student politics on campus, when they were campaigning for mental health, a big part of it was about having access to therapy and all those things, but was not necessarily also looking at the mental issues, of students, because it becomes counterintuitive if, both of them are not looked at the same time. And mental health citizenship. So I appropriated this from an anthropologist who wrote on biological citizenship. So basically, in Ukraine, Chernobyl, I think there's even a series about it. And after the Chernobyl, nuclear bombing, it's a bombing, yes, when the factory went off and whatever. There's a lot of in the air nuclear exposure, so a lot of people were exposed to nuclear exposure, and then the government sort of like tried to find a way to sort of like give people some sort of support or state remit, and the government was very instrumental into creating what Petrina Petrina terms biological citizenship. So the citizens of that particular place would have to go to a doctor, and a doctor would say, yeah, you've been exposed to nuclear, radiation and all those things. Therefore, you're entitled to state remit, because this is a state's fault or some sort. And then so I appropriate this time to think about how we, as students in a university, personally, create this thought of becoming part of a mental health citizenship. And obviously, it's not only from the student side, but it's also institutionally. So it's about recognition that, me as a Black student in a university, I'm also someone who exists within the discourse of mental health. By that, I mean that I can have problems of mental health and because of that, I am entitled to certain allowances, because of my membership in this mental health citizenship. And then um, similarities. So students after post-Christmas, so I'm looking at Esika's question, were very politicized. I'm not gonna even lie, and they there was bravado or some sort. Not saying that during fees was for at that time there's no sense of bravado, but there is a thing where you feel like they know they're entitled to certain things because of what Pismos for is and was for them. So there was lack of, being tentative, especially when I taught as a lecturer, at another university. And then the differences, I can't think of any at the moment. Yeah. And then Gati's question, I think it could be, it is such a, autoethnography, I think it's such a beautiful sort of like, mode of sort of like thinking about your own life. And I I didn't go for therapy until later on and all those things. So, and I can't say that, because of me, thinking about my own life, I was able to come to this self-diagnosis. But what rather was happening was that I was latching on to a lot of discourse that was going on, around issues of mental health. And the discourse doesn't necessarily only have to exist during in times of trauma, right? So it's also during times of academic stress and all those things. So I'm stressed. It's one thing. I'm feeling very anxious. It's one thing. And I'm a bit depressed, and depressed clinically because you're not being diagnosed. But I think I was latching onto that as well as really reflecting a lot on how I was feeling. But I would not necessarily say that I use autoethnography as something that I use to sort of like self-diagnose, which I think you're right is very important, to think about as a tool that can be very useful in diagnosing your own mental health. And then, oh, okay, I think that's about it, Topani. And then,
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. Okay, Tabani, you had your hand up, and I'm sorry I didn't give you a chance the other time around. Do you want to verbalize your question for KG? For Kagiso?
Sure, I had already typed it. I just wanted to know, let me just read it. The Council of Business for, although it provided solidarity, it has also highlighted the institutionality of issues that plague Black students. What do you think students can do themselves to change the perception that this is normal, the perception that mental strife is just part of getting a higher education? Thank you.
yeah, and
Right.
I don't think students. Oh yeah, other questions. Sorry.
Yes. Sorry. Diana, do you want to share your question, or should I just read it for you? So Diana had a comment about that the amount of effort that goes into self-care or self-love is another aspect not talked about enough. When you're at your wits
Yeah,
end, how much energy do we have to put into ourselves when the energy needs to be dispersed elsewhere, i.e. your studies? And then there's
yeah.
a comment from Emelina. Emelina says, "Hi, Kagiso, thank you for your presentation. In your experience and research, are Black students building a vocabulary to articulate their experience with mental health during and after their university experience? An example of such vocab would be imposter syndrome."
And that
And
was speaking
then,
more to Tabang, yes.
okay, Tabang, do you wanna verbalize? Because I saw your hand, but it was
No,
in the
no, he's no, he did verbalize it. Did he not?
sure.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That was Tabani, wasn't it?
That was Tabang, yeah, that was
Okay.
Tabang.
Yeah. So, but anyways, I can read it. It says, I'll just, so Keke, so if you want to read your comment, you can just prepare yourself after reading this. I'll give you an opportunity. So Tabang says, I'll just type my question for the next round. Has the societal groundswell of fees must fall, although it provided solidarity, it has also highlighted the institutionality of the issues that plague Black students. What do you think students do? Sorry, what do you think students do themselves to change the perception that this is normal, the perception that mental strife is just part of getting higher education? And then Kogetso wrote a really long comment for you. I don't know if you wanna read it yourself or if I should.
I don't see the comment. Oh, I see it. I see it. Yeah.
Sure.
Oof. Let me just answer
Okay.
these questions first.
Okay.
Okay, Tabang. I think students are really trying to show that struggling with your mental health in a university is not normal, right? And but I think it's not a lot, because I don't think universities create sort of like structures for students to do that. And as I was saying, I talked about 5 to 8 students who came forward, but more times than most, there are a lot of students, who can't come forward for a variety of reasons, which I can only speculate on, which is shame, which is, them. A big part of it is how, mental health is becoming sort of an excuse, a get out of jail card of some sort. And because of that, that's why I think there's still this maintenance that, that institution hold in terms of mental health, it's a big part of the especially in terms of psychological time, institutional time. At the end, this is a time where the exams is going to be challenging, your mental health is going to be short, and all those things, right? So, and then the university just thinks of it as just that, as just, it's just the pressures of the academy. And then a lot of why I got for my fieldwork was like there's a lack of sense of understanding that, this like mental health issues don't just come out of nowhere. And one person said that they don't mind that a university, your school, your curriculum is challenging. Challenging is one thing, but when it gets to a point that you're struggling because of either your mental health, because of your other material conditions, then it's a different story on its own. So I don't think students, are normalizing this, and they trying to normalize that, mental strife, is just something of, that's part of, higher education. Don't know if I answered your thing, but yeah. Emelina, thank you so much. I think she has slept, but I like the question so much. And yeah, I think again because of one for me, and that's why I took on this research. Students are latching on and building a vocabulary for themselves, especially as Black students, to talk about their everyday pleasures and experiences. So I think students are building that, and imposter syndrome is something I see a lot of social media. I also talk about imposter syndrome because, we exist in spaces where you feel like you're not enough, one, and you need to work so hard, in order for you to be recognized as someone who deserves to be in that space. So yeah, I think students are building a lot of vocabulary, and part of it is not only about diagnosable sort of like, but it's about using this language to talk about our everyday pleasures and experiences. Yeah. And then what was the other question? What was the other question, Qambela? I think I answered all of them.
Okay. You had True.
That,
So
that one was a comment, yeah.
Sure. Sipokoshe, please prepare yourself if you want to read out your comment yourself. So, okay, then Sipokoshe.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Thanks, Kagiso.
Hello.
Hi.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Oh, I had written there that I'm so interested in the issue of language, and language is something that immortalizes feelings, situations, etc. Through coloniality and apartheid, we are unable to unsee race. So how would you respond to the idea that mental health discourse as something that builds, inescapable walls around how we feel, how agentic we can be, etc. As Black people, I feel we are undergoing a shift where we have gone from feeling validated through being productive to being validated through having our feelings seen. And much of that is about the re-languaging of our existence through these new dominant discourses. Language, I guess, is limited in that it does not do the full work of making us feel connected, healthily regulated, etc. And so, on a tangent, it brings me to the feeling that even behavioral cognitive therapy or talk therapy should not continue as the dominant way of healing, because talking does some of the work, whilst the environment is something that can consolidate the full extent of healing possibility. And so I guess the thrust of my question is, what do we do with this issue of language? Because once you language something, you can't unsee it, and some of the dangers with that is that we will get to a point as a Black youth where we also misappropriate psychological terms. So at some point, every hurt will become a trauma. Every sort of affront might become a trigger, and so this language issue is also demarcating the lines of where we exist. And so my follow-up question, even on the question of citizenship then, is if we can talk about citizenship, we should also be talking about how do we travel away from the current state. And when we travel, where do we travel to? And I guess the spiritualists would say to connect with the ancestors is one way of traveling between the realms. Others would say being in the environment or the natural environment and being connected to the earth is one way of traveling. And I guess the Pasma sort of comrades would say this is a land issue. You need to be able to think outside of your current circumstances, and that is about space and temporality. So again, I'll just redirect you to my main question, which is about language and how it immortalizes or demarcates our current situation. I just want a response from you on that. Thank you.
What a question.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Kagiso, do you want to read out and articulate your critique or?
Thanks, Kagiso, for a lovely presentation. My question is on looking at the history of South Africa, specifically, and the position that Black people have occupied since colonial times and onwards, looking at apartheid. So, due to that history, Blackness is mostly associated with lack of something, right? Lack of opportunities, lack of progress, lack of access to resources. And your discussion around mental health and Black student experiences seem to reflect the same thing, that mental health is an issue that arises out of lack of something, lack of resources or lack of a space where you can study, lack of financial provision from home or from your university. So is it possible to talk about student struggles with mental health arising from having resources that are lacking. For example, where students who your parents have allowed you to go to school as a black child, probably the first one, and you are the under pressure of making them proud, or the pressures that come with the pressures that come with having doing so well academically and having access to scholarships, but yet you find yourself paralyzed by continuously doing well and thriving so that you can maintain that support financially. Is it possible to talk about mental health experiences in relation to black students when in the conditions of having rather than the lack of having something?
Okay,
Thanks.
I think that's a very good question. Thank you, Kagiso.
Okay, just before you address it, KG, there's one more question. If there's time, it's from Esihle again. He says he can't verbalize. He sent a private message that he can't unmute himself. But it says, I'm intrigued by the idea of citizenship, and my mind is blown away by the concept of mental health citizenship. Various forms of citizenship deal with many ways of belonging. I just wonder what the requirements of mental health citizenship is. So just before you, just to let people know, so the next round will be the last one. So if you have any other comments, please either raise your hand or type them in the comment section. I would prefer you type them because I'm going to ask you to verbalize them anyway. So just raise your hand. I'll be able to see after. So the next round will be the last because we don't want to exhaust KG too much. So you can.
I'm so exhausted. It's been a week. But thank you. Sipokuhle, wow. I think you're giving me a lot to think about, in terms of, language and, and stuff. But I don't think language, it might immortalize, but feelings, the situation, but we don't want to think about that as something that freezes people in time, right? So in my presentation, I remember talking about how even this sort of like discourse could be transient, right? It could be something that's used to go somewhere else, and it's not necessarily a destination. And I think Bell Hooks speaks to that we are evolving, blackness evolves, and and I remember speaking about how no, I don't remember speaking about it, but I always say that, especially in terms of my research and my practice, that I wanna look at people, black people, especially black lives and my own life, as something that's continuously transforming, evolving, and not necessarily something that stays there. It can stay there in terms of the archive, but later on it could be reconfigured and all that. So I don't, and then I think this is important to, like, the unseen part. I always feel like it's always brought forward as sort of like a caution of some sort. But I think it's so important for us to look at our blackness, as something that's sort of like a category of parties that we can use to transform, to evolve, and also to access certain entitlements. So yeah, I don't think there are inescapable borders with humanity, and more so black life and blackness. So yeah, and yeah, I agree fully with you on where there's a shift, and I like the fact that you're using a shift where we have validated through how productive we can be, and now how our feelings can be seen. That I get. And then Esihle, I think Esihle's question was next. Yeah. Or Keketo, no, sorry. Keketo, that's so interesting. And it's something I did not explore, but something that actually in my paper, even in this question and all those things, but expectations are some of the issues, that rise up, when students, are interviewed, or, even through engaging social media, which contributes to their mental health, the pressure, the stress, so I do have a lot. I do have fees. My fees are paid. I stay in rest, whatever. But I'm feeling so much pressure to perform and to do well and to go back and be a breadwinner and all those things. And you're right, definitely. I think mental health is not, only about lack as I positioned it. I think in terms of this presentation, I just positioned it in that way because I think it's something that needs, immediate attention, and it's something that really sort of like affects a lot of black people. But you're right. I also had white students when I was at the University of Road who also had a lot and whatever, but they also had mental health issues. Yeah. But something like looking at blackness, in terms of this lens is something definitely I can try and explore later on with other papers maybe. But thank you for that question. And then the concept of citizenship, yeah. So with a trainer Petrina case, you had to be a Ukrainian national in order for you to um, access, state remit and all those things. But when I looked at mine, it was even about self-inscription. So it was not even about I need to be brought into this mental health citizenship, in order for me to become a member. I looked at it as something that's purely based on, how students also go about, self-inscribing, this mental health citizenry, that exists, in a university. So I did not necessarily explore, and the whole thought about this is that I appropriated the term for understanding, how even sort of like different individuals, think about the mental health and the institutionalized nature of mental health in university, and I just clumped it under this term of mental health citizenship. And I also looked a lot at Anderson's concept of imagined community, that people who live in an imagined community don't necessarily have to have met each other or whatever, but they just belong. So I sort of like thought about it in that sense, that the only requirement is for a student to say that I'm dealing with mental health issues, I'm dealing with issues of precarity and whatever, and all those things, and therefore I'm part of the mental health citizen. Obviously, they did not say that, but for me, that's how sort of like I made sense of it. So it was more about self-inscription more than anything. And yeah, I think I'm done with the questions.
Okay, thank you so much, KG. So there's just 2 questions in the comment section, and then you can also just close us off. So the first one says, are you hoping to use your research, or by the way, it's Tabane Maseko. Are you hoping to use your research as some sort of intervention to address mental health issues within South African universities, since you're at Wits and UK? And then question number 2 is, what is it that universities are getting wrong? Because even my colleagues suffer from mental health illness, e.g., citing the case of late Dr. Bongani Mayosi. And then the last one is just a reflection. So it says mental illness involves a lot of things or factors which I think are beyond the control of universities. The question is, can universities address their mental health? And then a comment from Shandu who says, this is divine. Thank you, KG. Okay, I think you can respond to that and then offer us your closing remarks, and then we will close the day.
Masifo is a development and M&E specialist, so I understand why she would ask how I use this to intervene, with this. But I was asked this question last week when I presented to an MPH class, and I said that universities know this. They know this, and part of why I'm striving as someone who wants to remain in academia is to document, more than anything, and how that matters also, and not necessarily that it needs to sort of like do something. And then I think it's doing something in a sense of it's really giving us ways to look back and think about our own blackness as people. So I haven't thought about that, Maseho. Maybe you can think about that and maybe we can team up. I don't know. What are you know? What is that universities are getting wrong? Because even I think for me it's a lot of caring work that sometimes it's lacking, right? And for universities that exist in a country such as ours, where there are high levels of poverty and inequality, there's something a lack of care and understanding about where students come from or are in, and that's institution. It comes from the higher up in terms of, universities being results driven. We need to maintain, we need to maintain the standard. We need to do this, and there's sort of like a human element that's, sort of like taken out of there, and universities are concerned about world rankings, publishing, teaching, and all these things. You get it? Which at the heart of it, there are students who don't have a lot. A lot of students come to universities. Universities was the most expensive, school I've ever attended, and I think this goes for a lot of black students, right? It's expensive. It's expensive, and looking at employment, unemployment, rates, and all these things, I'm just like, there is such lack of compassion and care, for institutions that exist in a country such as ours. And universities obviously are not wholly responsible for this, but universities are part of a state. So 26 South African universities are actually public universities, which is always wild in terms of how public institutions, can exclude so many students, like with what's happening now, considering that they are state institutions that are there to sort of like, cater to the public. We pay taxes in South Africa. I think we're one of the highest taxes in the nation, so in the world, I mean, and all those things. So I don't think universities can do a lot, but they can play their part. And university is part of the state. I think the state could do a lot more in terms of elevating some of the sort of like structural issues that students face when they get to university, that consequently contributes to issues of mental health. Yeah.
Okay, close us off. What are your final remarks? What do you want us to take away from this before we go?
I think thank you for the comments, guys, and thank you for pitching. I know, it's such a tough time now. I'm struggling with the internet and all those, and so it's always amazing, to sort of like have this sort of like scholarship and community. Students could be supported a bit more, and I've been quite frustrated this past week with what's been happening on social media, and all those things. And so universities are there to teach, and as Maswa has pointed, that they can't fully solve these issues of mental health, and mental health issues, as Kagiso has sort of like poignantly pointed out, are not necessarily only a purview of lack or maternal issues and all those things, But what could be done is that the state could do a lot more in terms of supporting, the majority black population of South Africa in getting education. And more than anything, I think I'm quite happy to see black students using the discourse of mental health to make sense of their own lives and to fight for entitlements, which are due to them from the state. Yeah, that's about it. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Maso will talk. Tweet me at Kagiso _, and then we can talk some more.
Fantastic.
And this is a working paper. I welcome any critical feedback and comments. So thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so much, KG. Cheers. Cheers, everyone.
Bye. Bye, Tshwanelo. Yo.